Doug Wiley with Police Magazine. I'm here with Nick Greco, a good friend of mine and great friend of law enforcement. You, like I, are civilian supporters of law enforcement. One of the things that you help officers better understand is something that's becoming an increasingly frequent type of call, which is dealing with the mentally ill or dealing with emotionally disturbed persons. Oftentimes the hospital isn't contacted. A psychologist's office isn't contacted. Even sometimes the advocacy for the homeless isn't contacted. It's someone sees, quote, crazy person out on the street, and they call the cops. And so the cops are kind of the first responders to so many of these types of crises, and they're not necessarily prepared, with the appropriate training to do what is necessary to bring the incident to a peaceful, to a peaceful end. So, what are some of the things that your organization does to help better educate law enforcement officers dealing with these individuals?
So my organization is C3 Education and Research, and we're a training and consulting company, and we work with a number of departments across the country, and mainly in Illinois and Wisconsin. And so what we do is train a lot of officers on CIT, which is Crisis Intervention Training, which is how to handle individuals presenting with mental illness. So whether an individual suffering from depression, bipolar disorder, schizophrenia, also as well as individuals suffering from dementia, such as Alzheimer's. So we're training individuals on that. And it's some of the non-verbal techniques and as well as nonverbal, how to position yourself, how to make eye contact, how to maintain your own officer safety, but then the verbal things, such as how to talk to an individual, what kind of tone of voice. So if we're dealing with somebody with autism, we want to turn our radio down. We want to have a very calm environment. If we're working with somebody who is agitated and upset, want to demonstrate that the individual has an opportunity to feel that they're being listened to, that we want to have the officer take time. That's one of the big things we also make sure of. We tell the officer, take their time, slow things down. We also, when we train officers, we also make sure that they understand that no matter how well you verbally de-escalate, you also have to remember you may have to revert to your police training. Some things can, no matter how well you're verbally de-escalating, go to less lethal and potentially lethal methods. So we also want to make sure that officer safety is a priority and that the officer goes home at the end of the day safely.
Right. We have these conversations in the hallways. We have these conversations informally over dinner and lunch and what have you. We have 800 or so of the best police trainers in the country, well, frankly, in the world. We've got people from Europe and Canada and all over. Yeah. One of the things that I find really interesting, and I'm going to ask you in this way, when people come to your classes at ILETA and they are the trainers, it's kind of a train the trainer type of a thing that you're doing here. And so they walk away with a great deal more understanding of how they can bring back to their agency some of the things. So by proxy, you're helping to spread the word of law enforcement officers' safety and also success in dealing with people who are, mentally, emotionally challenged or in crisis or, with impaired even. You have these new techniques and tactics that they can bring back to their officers, right?
So I'll give you an example. One officer said, they make us go through CIT, and I really don't believe in it as much. And I had this one officer, and I said, okay. So we gave him an example. He was giving one of my other instructors a difficult time, and the way it worked was he's like, well, if they shoplift, I'm just going to ask them if they shoplift. I'm going to take them away. I got other calls to take, and I'm going to haul them away. I'm like, okay, well, let me try something. You stand up. I'm going to sit in the chair, and I'm sitting in the chair, and I go, do the same routine with me. And he asked me if I shoplift. I'm like, yeah. And he's like, all right, get up. I go, I can't. And he's like, well, why not? I go, I can't move. He goes, well, I'm like, yeah, I just can't move. I'm stuck. And he's like, okay. He goes, you think you can move if I lift you up? I'm like, well, you can try. Well, as he does that, I'm just dead weight. I drop. And what I did, I demonstrated an individual in an off state of Parkinson's, where they cannot move. And part of this particular symptom set in this individual with Parkinson's is that they will potentially have kleptomania. So it rang a bell with him, and kind of snapped him into realizing that, you know what, whoa. And he was, for those 5 days then, he converted over. So a lot of times, if we take this out of the very educational part of it, the academic, we have to have this as a real world training. And that's what I like to bring to the officers, whether I'm training at ILEETA, whether I'm doing CIT training back home. I'm always trying to have real life events where they can use something and it kind of it gets that light bulb off in their head where they can actually think about it. It's like, oh, yeah, there's medical issues here too, but there's also psychiatric ones, and we want to marry those two together.
Yeah, and this problem has been bad for a long time. Officers
Since
have
the
been
1960s.
have been dealing with people who are mentally or in some way challenged, but it's probably gotten worse because the mental health care, kind of infrastructure in America it seems to be less than it was. It seems to be less capable than it was. And then you add to the fact that there are some people now who are more likely or more prone to have over-response emotionally or mentally to stimulus, things like social media, things like significantly more violent content in films, movies, books, etc. They're exposed to certain things that might be that quote trigger them right into an over response emotionally. So, and officers are the people who are on the front lines. Like I said earlier, you don't have a 911 version for mental health. You just have 911, and people come out to those calls. Generally speaking, are law enforcement. They're not even the paramedics who might even have some of that type of CIT training. So, what can we do to address the fact? Not from a police perspective, but so you have a public information officer. They have the opportunity after an incident, maybe it's captured on video and they have to answer questions about it. They have the opportunity to address the elephant in the room that we really need as a country to provide better mental and emotional support to people who are in need, right?
Yeah, and that's, ever since we go back from the 1960s when they deinstitutionalized and they released people and they thought there was going to be community outpatient centers and such, we have had a problem in this country. And I've been in the field for over 20 years, and I've just seen it get worse and worse. So we need CIT trained officers. We need people to be trained in mental health first aid and such, having the public aware of these things. But they become almost a Band-Aid in a sense when we don't have the outpatient care centers. So we can, so an officer can interact with somebody, do everything perfectly, bring them to the hospital. They get admitted to the hospital for 3 or 5 days, whatever the insurance will allow. And then after discharge, where do they go? That's a big problem because we don't have the outpatient care services. We don't have enough psychiatrists, we don't have enough counselors, we don't have enough community health centers. So the vicious cycle repeats itself. And if the person recants and says they're not suicidal, they're not homicidal, we have nothing to involuntarily commit them on, they don't want to come into the hospital, they go back on the street. So a lot of officers that I work with, that I talk with, they're like, we see these people within 8 hours, sometimes the next day. And so it's just a vicious cycle. So if we don't kind of plug that, the Band-Aid's there. This is great. CIT is wonderful, but it only does so much without that, without a safety net. And we don't have a lot of safety nets. There's more and more mental health institutions closing.
Right. So yeah, and to your point, police are addressing the symptom, not the cause.
No.
I want to thank you very much for all of the training that you do, not just here at ILEETA, but back in your home state and throughout the United States, of helping officers be better prepared for these very demanding scenarios.
Thank you.
Doug Wiley, Police Magazine.